The morning Annabelle's marriage ended, she was embroidering a winter rose onto a silk handkerchief in the drawing room. She had been counting the stitches, 47 so far, when a footman appeared at the door, his face pale and his hands clasped too tightly in front of him. He could barely meet her eyes. "His Grace requests your presence in the study, Your Grace, at once." Annabelle set the needle down, folded the handkerchief neatly over the arm of the chair, and stood without a single question. She had known this day was coming. She had known it for longer than Marcus would have guessed. The corridor leading to his study stretched long and cold beneath the painted portraits of every duke who had ever held the Ashwood name. Their stern faces watched her pass as if they already knew what would happen behind that oak door. She walked with a straight back, her cream muslin dress brushing the polished floor, her dark hair pinned simply beneath a lace cap. She looked like what Marcus had always called her, a country wife of no importance. She opened the door herself. Marcus stood behind his writing desk with his arms crossed. He wore a dark blue morning coat, freshly pressed, with a gold watch chain glinting at his waist. His jaw was set in the particular way he used when he wanted to appear commanding. Beside him stood Mr. Aldrich, the family solicitor, a thin man with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers who refused to look up from the stack of papers spread across the desk. There was a third chair in the room, positioned on the opposite side of the desk like a witness box. Annabelle understood immediately. This was a trial, and she was the accused. "Sit down, Annabelle." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Marcus picked up the top sheet of paper and held it between two fingers as though it carried something unpleasant. "I will be direct with you. I have instructed Mr. Aldrich to prepare formal separation documents, followed by a petition for divorce through the ecclesiastical courts. The grounds are incompatibility of station." Annabelle looked at him steadily. "Incompatibility of station," she repeated. "Yes." He set the paper down and placed both palms flat on the desk. "When I married you 3 years ago, I believed your family held modest but respectable standing. I have since learned that your background is far more obscure than you represented. You brought no meaningful dowry, no connections of value, and no family name that carries weight in any drawing room in England. Frankly, Annabelle, it has become an embarrassment." Mr. Aldrich shifted in his chair. He still would not look at her. "I see," Annabelle said quietly. "And the replacement?" A faint color rose in Marcus's cheeks. He straightened his cravat, a nervous habit she had catalogued years ago. "Lady Genevieve Harcourt has accepted my courtship. She is the daughter of the Earl of Pemberton. She brings a dowry of £12,000, and her family connections will restore the reputation this household requires. The arrangement has already been agreed upon." So he had negotiated the terms of his new marriage before ending the old one. Annabelle let that thought settle without giving it any expression on her face. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, turning to the solicitor, "may I read the documents?" The solicitor finally looked up, startled, as though he had expected weeping or shouting or the kind of scene that made for good gossip at London dinner parties. He pushed the stack toward her with visible reluctance. Annabelle took the papers and read every line. She turned each page slowly, her finger tracing the margins where the clauses were written in Aldrich's cramped handwriting. She read the grounds for divorce. She read the proposed financial settlement, which was nothing. She read the clause that assigned her no property, no pension, and no continued use of the Ashwood title. Marcus watched her with growing impatience.
"It is all quite standard." "It is all quite thorough," Annabelle corrected gently. She set the papers down and looked at him with an expression that Marcus could not read. It bothered him. It had always bothered him that he could never quite tell what she was thinking. "You have left me nothing at all." "You came with nothing, you leave with nothing. That is the natural order of things." Something flickered behind Annabelle's eyes, brief and sharp, like a match struck in a dark room.
and then it was gone. "Very well," she said. "I will sign." Marcus blinked. He had clearly prepared for resistance. His shoulders had been braced, his arguments lined up like soldiers. Her calm agreement left him standing in formation with no enemy to charge. "You will sign?" "I will." She reached across the desk and took the quill from the inkstand. She dipped it once, tapped the excess against the rim, and signed her name at the bottom of the separation deed in clean, unhurried letters. She set the quill down and pushed the document back toward Mr. Aldridge. "I request only my personal trunks," she said. "2 traveling cases and 1 wooden desk. They are in the blue bedroom upstairs. Everything else, the gowns Marcus purchased, the jewelry, the household items, may remain." Marcus frowned. "That is all you want?" "That is all I need." He stared at her for a long, uncertain moment. Her composure unnerved him. A woman being cast aside should protest, should bargain, should beg. She was doing none of those things, and it made him feel as though he had missed something important in the room, like a door left open behind him that he could not see. "Then we are finished here," he said stiffly. "I expect you to vacate the estate by this afternoon. A carriage can be arranged." Annabelle stood and smoothed the front of her dress. "I shall arrange my own transport, thank you." She walked toward the door, and just before she reached it, she paused. She did not turn around. "Marcus?" "What?" "You mentioned Lady Genevieve's dowry of £12,000. "What of it?" A small, quiet pause. "You should check how much of it you will actually be permitted to spend. Debts have a way of arriving at the most inconvenient moments." She left the room before he could respond. The door clicked shut behind her with the softest sound, barely louder than a heartbeat. Marcus stood still for several seconds, the words hanging in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Then he shook his head, dismissed the strange feeling crawling up his spine, and turned back to Mr. Aldridge. "Have the servants prepare Lady Genevieve's rooms," he said. "She arrives this afternoon." He did not notice that Annabelle's signature on the divorce papers was written in a hand far too practiced, far too precise, far too deliberate for a woman who was supposedly nobody from nowhere. But Mr. Aldridge noticed, and for the rest of that morning, the solicitor could not stop his hands from trembling. Annabelle packed her trunks herself. She dismissed the maid who came to help, closed the bedroom door, and worked in silence. 2 leather traveling cases received her personal clothing, plain day dresses, a wool traveling cloak, a pair of sturdy boots, and a handful of private letters tied with brown string. She left the silk gowns hanging in the wardrobe. She left the pearl earrings Marcus had given her on their first anniversary untouched on the dressing table. The third item was the one that mattered most. A wooden travel desk, compact and well-worn, with brass hinges and a carrying handle on top. Annabelle placed it into a canvas bag, buckled it shut, and set it beside the door. By 1:30, she was standing in the front hall with her belongings near the entrance. The head butler, Mr. Cavendish, appeared from the servants' corridor. He was a tall man with silver hair and a careful face that rarely showed emotion, but today his mouth was pressed into a thin, unhappy line.
"Your Grace," he said quietly, "the Duke has instructed that a carriage from the estate stables be made available for your departure." Annabelle glanced through the front windows at the vehicle waiting in the drive. It was the oldest carriage in the Ashwood collection, a battered landau with a cracked leather hood and a horse that looked half asleep between the shafts. The message was clear. Marcus wanted her to leave, like the poor, unremarkable woman he believed her to be. "Thank you, Mr. Cavendish, but I have already sent word to the coaching office in the village. A private post-chaise will collect me within the hour." The butler's expression softened with something close to relief. "Very good, Your Grace."
Annabelle could feel the weight of everything Mr. Cavendish wanted to say, but would never allow himself to speak aloud. She gave him a small nod, just enough, and he returned it. The post-chaise arrived at 2:15, a smart, clean carriage drawn by 2 fresh horses, hired and paid for with Annabelle's own coin. The driver loaded her trunks while Annabelle carried the canvas bag herself. She was halfway down the front steps when the sound of hooves and wheels on gravel made her stop. A gleaming black barouche swept through the estate gates. The door opened before the footman could reach it, and Lady Genevieve Harcourt stepped out, as though she were arriving at her own coronation. She was tall, fair-haired, dressed in a deep green riding habit trimmed with velvet at the collar and cuffs. A feathered hat sat pinned at an angle above her curled hair, and she carried a pair of kid-skin gloves in one hand. Her eyes swept the front of Ashwood Manor with the satisfied expression of someone measuring curtains before the previous owner had finished moving out. Then she saw Annabelle. "Ah," Genevieve said, and her voice carried the particular brightness of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "So you are still here? I had assumed you would have gone by now." Annabelle adjusted the strap of the canvas bag on her shoulder. "I am just leaving, Lady Genevieve." Genevieve looked at Annabelle's plain dress, her simple hair, her worn traveling cloak. A smile curled at the edge of her lips. She turned to one of the footmen who had followed her from the barouche. "Before she goes, check her trunks. I want to be certain she has not packed any of the household silver. One cannot be too careful with people of unknown origin." The footman hesitated. Mr. Cavendish, who had followed Annabelle to the front steps, stiffened visibly. Annabelle set the canvas bag down at her feet and faced Genevieve directly. Her voice remained steady, and she spoke with the precision of someone who had read the relevant statutes more than once. "Under the existing common law of personal chattels, any items I brought into this marriage or acquired through my own independent means remain my legal property. My trunks contain my personal clothing, my private correspondence, and a writing desk that belonged to me before I ever set foot in this house. You have no authority to search them, Lady Genevieve. You are a guest in this household. I am, for another few hours at least, still its Duchess." The silence that followed was enormous. Genevieve's smile disappeared. She opened her mouth to respond, but every servant within earshot had stopped moving, and every pair of eyes was watching her. Mr. Cavendish stepped forward. "Her Grace's belongings have been accounted for. I will personally confirm the inventory if Lady Genevieve requires documentation." Genevieve looked at the butler, then back at Annabelle, and her jaw tightened. She turned on her heel without another word and walked through the front door of Ashwood Manor as though she already owned it. Annabelle picked up the canvas bag, descended the remaining steps, and climbed into the post-chaise. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Annabelle looked back at the house one final time through the small rear window. She watched the stone facade grow smaller, the ivy-covered walls, the tall chimneys, the windows where she had spent countless quiet evenings while Marcus dined in London with a woman he thought nobody knew about. The Black Swan Inn sat at the edge of Blackwood Village, a respectable coaching house with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof. Annabelle arrived before dusk and requested a private parlor on the first floor with a locked door. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Darrow, showed her upstairs personally and asked no questions. She brought tea, a plate of cold ham and bread, and a fresh candle without being asked. When the key turned in the lock, Annabelle sat down at the table and placed the wooden travel desk in front of her. She pressed a hidden latch on the underside, and the bottom panel slid open to reveal a second compartment lined with dark velvet. Inside lay a gold signet ring engraved with a crest that had not been seen publicly in England for over a decade. Beside it sat a folded square of parchment, sealed with crimson wax and stamped with the royal cipher of the House of Montfort. Annabelle, or rather the woman the world would soon come to know by a very different name, lifted the ring from its velvet bed and held it up to the candlelight. The game, at last, was about to begin. Sleep came easily to Annabelle that night, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake, listening to the creaking timbers of the old inn, turning over everything that had happened at Ashwood Manor. She had expected the sting of Marcus's words to settle in once the day's resolve wore off. Instead, she slept soundly for 8 hours and woke before dawn with a clear head and steady hands. Perhaps that was because the marriage had never been what Marcus thought it was. She dressed in a plain gray wool dress, tied her hair back, and sat at the parlor table while the first pale light crept through the window. The wooden travel desk sat open before her, the hidden compartment beneath the false bottom laid bare. The gold signet ring rested on a square of velvet beside 2 sheets of heavy writing paper, watermarked with a pattern only visible when held to the light. A glass bottle of ink sat beside a steel-nibbed pen, and tucked at the back was a slim book bound in dark red calfskin. Annabelle opened the book to a marked page, columns of numbers and letters in pairs, a substitution cipher used exclusively by the House of Montfort for communication with the Crown's judicial officers. She had memorized most of it, but for a dispatch of this importance, she would make no errors. She dipped the pen and began to write. The first letter was addressed to Sir Edward Halling, Lord Chancellor of the High Court of Chancery. Written in the cipher, it detailed 3 years of observations at Ashwood Manor, specifically the financial records she had examined in Marcus's study on evenings when he believed she was reading novels by the fire. She described the pattern. Marcus had been taking out mortgages against properties he did not fully own, using falsified valuations from a compliant surveyor. He had used those funds to maintain a London townhouse where Lady Genevieve had been installed for 2 years. The debts were rolled over repeatedly, each new loan covering the interest on the last, a tower of obligations that would collapse the moment a creditor called in their claim. She had dates, figures, and the names of every bank and solicitor involved. The second letter was shorter, addressed to Lord Ashford, the keeper of the royal seal, requesting formal reinstatement of her public identity. For 3 years, Archduchess Clara of the House of Montfort had lived under the name Annabelle, chosen because it attracted no attention.
The House of Montfort had sent her to investigate financial fraud among the landed gentry, and Marcus's estate had been under quiet scrutiny. She had married him as part of that investigation. He had divorced her for being a nobody, when she outranked every person he had ever tried to impress. She finished both letters, folded them, and sealed each one with crimson wax. The impression was the Montfort crest, a crowned falcon with spread wings above 3 crossed swords. Anyone who recognized that seal would treat these dispatches with the highest urgency. She placed the signet ring on her right hand. She had worn it every day for 23 years before setting it aside to become Annabelle. A knock at the parlor door came at 7:30. "Come in," she said. The door opened and a man entered, tall, lean, dressed in the plain brown coat and riding boots of an ordinary country traveler. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and moved with the quiet economy of someone who had spent years going unnoticed. "Your Grace," he said, and the 2 words carried more weight than anything Marcus had said to her in 3 years of marriage. "Mr. Elliot?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, please. I have 2 dispatches for London." He sat and accepted the sealed letters, examining the wax impressions. "The Lord Chancellor and the Keeper of the Seal, both in cipher?" "Both. The Chancellor's letter contains the full financial summary.
Lord Ashford's requests reinstatement. I want both delivered by the end of the week." Mr. Elliot placed the letters inside his satchel, in a compartment lined with oilskin. "The Chancellor will want to convene a review. That could take several weeks." "I am aware. That is why Marcus must remain confident during that time. He must believe the divorce is proceeding in his favor. If he suspects anything, he will destroy records." Mr. Elliot nodded. "And the land purchases? He has been bidding heavily at the regional auctions." "I know." Annabelle folded her hands on the table. "That is precisely where we will catch him. Every parcel he bids on with borrowed money is another thread we can pull. Let him keep spending. The more he stretches himself, the less room he will have when the ground shifts beneath him." Mr. Elliot studied her. "You have been planning this for a long time." "I have been planning this since the evening I found his second set of ledgers hidden behind the atlas in his library. That was 14 months ago." She stood and walked to the window. The village was waking, a baker's boy carrying loaves across the lane, smoke rising from chimneys into the gray morning sky. "There is one more thing," she said. "I want the House of Montfort to begin purchasing Marcus's outstanding debts, quietly, through intermediaries. Every mortgage, every loan, every open line of credit. All of it in our hands before he steps into a courtroom." Mr. Elliot rose and placed his hat on his head. "I will send word to the family's agents in London today." "Thank you, Mr. Elliot." He paused at the door. "If I may, it is good to use your proper title again." Annabelle turned from the window. For the first time in days, something close to a smile crossed her face. "It has been a long 3 years. Let us make certain they were worth it." The courier left through the inn's back courtyard, mounted a fast horse, and was on the London road before the village church bell struck 8. Annabelle returned to the table and locked the hidden compartment. She placed the signet ring back inside. She would not wear it publicly yet. There were still a few more moves to make before the world learned who she really was. And Marcus, sitting in his study at Ashwood Manor at that very moment, was pouring himself a celebratory glass of brandy, already planning the menu for his engagement dinner with Lady Genevieve. He had no idea what was riding toward London on the back of a fast horse. The village of Blackwood had one solicitor, and his name was Mr. Pritchard. He kept a narrow office above the bakery on the high street, with a single desk buried under papers. He was 60 years old, honest to a fault, and had spent his career handling tenancy disputes and inheritance quarrels for local farmers. Annabelle had chosen him for exactly that reason. She needed a local witness with no connection to Marcus's London legal circle, and Mr. Pritchard's reputation for integrity had reached her during her years at Ashwood. She arrived at 2:30, dressed simply, carrying a leather portfolio. She explained that she expected a visitor within the hour, a solicitor from the Duke's estate presenting additional documents related to her divorce. "I would like you to observe the meeting and take notes," she told him. Mr. Pritchard looked at her carefully. He had heard the rumors, the whole village had. The Duke had cast off his wife for a younger, wealthier woman. "I can, Your Grace," he said, "and I will." At 3:15, Mr. Aldrich climbed the narrow staircase with a leather case under his arm. Behind him came a younger clerk, carrying additional documents and an inkwell. Mr. Aldrich paused when he saw Mr. Pritchard sitting at the corner desk with a fresh sheet of paper. He had expected to find Annabelle alone. "That is, Your Grace," Mr. Aldrich began, correcting himself with visible discomfort. "I have been instructed by His Grace the Duke to present an additional clause to the terms of your separation." "Please sit down, Mr. Aldrich," Annabelle said. He sat. The clerk remained standing near the door, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Aldrich opened his leather case and produced a single document, thick, covered in dense legal writing, with Marcus's seal pressed into red wax at the bottom. He placed it on the desk between them and cleared his throat. "This is a rider to the original divorce petition," he said. "His Grace's position is that during your marriage, you misrepresented your family background, social standing, and financial means. This constitutes a breach of the implied covenant of good faith underpinning any marital contract between persons of rank." Annabelle listened without expression. "As a result," Mr. Aldrich continued, "His Grace is claiming an indemnity of £4,000 to be paid from whatever personal assets you may possess as compensation for the reputational harm caused to the Ashwood name." The room went quiet. Mr. Pritchard's pen stopped moving. Even the clerk by the door glanced up. £4,000. A working family could live comfortably for a decade on that sum. And Marcus was demanding it from a woman he had just described as penniless. Annabelle picked up the document and read it the same way she had read the divorce papers, slowly, thoroughly, with the calm focus that made people underestimate her. She turned each page, her eyes moving line by line through the clauses and subclauses. When she finished, she set the document down and folded her hands. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "there are 3 errors in this document. Any one of them would render the claim unenforceable. Together, they suggest that whoever drafted this did so in haste and without consulting the relevant statutes." Mr. Aldrich stiffened. "I assure you, the document was prepared with the full authority of—" "The first error," Annabelle said, as though he had not spoken, "is in the second clause. You cite the Marital Covenant Act as your legal basis for the indemnity claim. That act applies exclusively to contracts of betrothal, not to marriages already solemnized. Once the marriage was performed in church, the betrothal covenant dissolved. You are citing a law that no longer applies to our situation." Mr. Aldrich opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "The second error is in the 4th clause. You claim that I failed to present a dowry at the time of marriage. However, under the terms of our original marriage settlement, which I have a copy of and which you apparently did not review, the dowry was explicitly waived by His Grace in writing. He signed a clause stating that no dowry was required or expected. He cannot now claim damages for the absence of something he formally agreed to forego." Mr. Pritchard was writing furiously. "The third error," Annabelle continued, "is the most serious. The indemnity figure of £4,000 is listed as payable to the Duke personally. Under Chancery rules, any financial claim arising from a divorce proceeding must be directed through the court, not to an individual party. By structuring this as a direct payment, Mr. Aldrich, your client has effectively drafted a private debt instrument disguised as a legal petition. That is fraud." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Aldrich's face had gone the color of old paper. His clerk was staring at the floor. Mr. Pritchard had stopped writing and was looking at Annabelle with an expression that fell somewhere between astonishment and admiration. "I will keep this copy of the document," Annabelle said, sliding it into her leather portfolio. "I trust you will inform His Grace that his claim has no legal standing, and I would advise you, Mr. Aldrich, to consider very carefully whether you wish to continue representing a client who is asking you to file fraudulent instruments with the court. Your professional reputation is worth more than his fees." Mr. Aldrich stood. He gathered his case, gestured to his clerk, and walked to the door without a word. His footsteps on the staircase were quick and uneven, like a man trying to leave before the ceiling came down. When the door closed, Mr. Pritchard set his pen down and exhaled. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I have been practicing law in this village for 30 years. I have never seen anything like that." Annabelle tucked the portfolio under her arm and rose from her chair. "Keep your notes safe, Mr. Pritchard. You may be asked to present them in a London courtroom before long." She left the office and stepped into the afternoon light on the high street. The church bell was ringing 4 o'clock, and a cart rattled past carrying hay bales. She allowed herself one deep breath, the kind that comes after holding something tightly for a very long time. 3 errors, 3 threads pulled from the fabric of Marcus's confidence, and somewhere on the London road, her dispatches were drawing closer to the High Court with every mile. Marcus had always loved an auction. There was something about the atmosphere that suited him, the polished wood of the bidding hall, the rows of wealthy men in tailored coats, the quiet power of raising a numbered paddle and watching someone else lower theirs. It made him feel like the man he believed he was, important, commanding, untouchable. The Town Guild Hall in Chelsworth was the finest auction house in the region. Pale stone, tall arched windows, a vaulted ceiling. It hosted quarterly sales of land and estates that drew buyers from 3 counties. Today's catalog included 12 lots, and Marcus had come for one. A 200-acre parcel of coastal farmland near Whitmore Bay, with a sheltered harbor that could be converted into a private shipping dock. He had been eyeing the land for months. With Lady Genevieve's dowry nearly secured and his name about to carry the weight of the Earl of Pemberton's family alliance, the purchase would complete his vision of becoming the most powerful landowner on the southern coast. Genevieve sat beside him in the gallery, dressed in a lavender silk gown with white lace at the sleeves, her hair arranged beneath a feathered bonnet. She held a painted fan in one gloved hand and used it occasionally, partly for the warmth of the crowded room.
They had arrived together in Marcus's finest carriage, and he had made certain every person in the Guildhall saw them enter. This was their public debut as a couple. "That parcel will be ours before the hour is out," he told Genevieve, leaning close. "Once we hold Whitmore Bay, no family in this county will be able to compete with our shipping reach." Genevieve smiled. "And the cost?" "Managed," Marcus said, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by a bank. The auctioneer, Mr. Hargrove, opened the bidding for Lot 9 at £600. 2 local landowners raised their paddles. A solicitor, bidding on behalf of an unnamed client, joined at £700. Marcus waited. He let the smaller fish circle the bait before he entered the water. At £850, one of the landowners dropped out. At £900, the solicitor hesitated. Marcus raised his paddle. £1,000, he called, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Heads turned, murmurs rippled through the gallery. A bid of £1,000 for farmland was aggressive, even by Chelsworth standards. The solicitor glanced at his papers, shook his head, and lowered his paddle. Mr. Hargrove scanned the room. £1,000 to the Duke of Ashwood. Do I hear 1,100? Silence. 1,000 going once? 1,000 going twice? Marcus sat back in his chair, satisfaction settling across his face like sunlight. Genevieve placed her gloved hand on his arm. The hammer rose. And then Mr. Hargrove paused. A clerk had appeared at the side of the auctioneer's podium, holding a folded document sealed with a heavy wax stamp. He whispered something into Mr. Hargrove's ear and placed the document on the lectern. Mr. Hargrove unfolded it, read it once, and then read it again. The room waited. Mr. Hargrove removed his spectacles, cleaned them, replaced them, and looked up at the gallery with the expression of a man delivering news he wished he did not have. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I must suspend the bidding on Lot 9. I have received a court-certified notice from the High Court of Chancery indicating that the primary mortgage on this parcel has been purchased in full by a private buyer. Under Chancery rules, no property with an outstanding transferred mortgage may change hands at public auction until the new mortgage holder grants written clearance." The murmurs became a wave. Every head in the gallery turned toward the auctioneer, then toward Marcus. Marcus sat forward. "What private buyer?" Mr. Hargrove consulted the document again. "The mortgage has been acquired by the House of Montfort, acting through a registered agent in London. The court notice is dated 2 days ago
and carries the seal of the Lord Chancellor." The name meant nothing to most of the room. A few of the older landowners exchanged glances. The House of Montfort was ancient, reclusive, and connected to the highest circles of the realm. Most people had not heard the name spoken aloud in years. Marcus had never heard it at all. "This is absurd," he said, rising from his seat. "I have financing arranged. The bank has approved my credit. You cannot halt a sale on the basis of a transferred mortgage." "I can, Your Grace," Mr. Hargrove said evenly, "and I am required to by law. The sale of Lot 9 is suspended until further notice. I will proceed to Lot 10. Genevieve's fan had stopped moving. She was watching Marcus with the expression of someone who had just noticed a crack running through the foundation of a house she had already agreed to buy. Marcus stood in the gallery for a long, rigid moment, his face darkening. The eyes of every buyer, solicitor, and spectator in the room were on him. He sat down slowly, adjusted his coat, and said nothing for the rest of the auction. He did not bid on any other lot. On the carriage ride back to Ashwood Manor, Genevieve spoke first. "Who is the House of Montfort?" "Nobody," Marcus said tightly. "Some ancient family with more titles than sense. It is a procedural delay, nothing more. My solicitor will have it resolved within the week." Genevieve studied his profile. "You seem troubled for a man who believes it is nothing." Marcus turned to look at her, and for the first time since their courtship began, his expression carried something she had never seen from him before. Uncertainty. "It will be resolved," he repeated. The carriage rolled on through the late afternoon countryside, past stone walls and sheep pastures. Marcus stared out the window and tried to remember if he had ever heard the name Montfort. In a letter, a legal document, a passing conversation. He could not place it. And that, more than anything else that had happened in the Guildhall, was what kept him awake that night. Somewhere in a quiet room at the Black Swan Inn, Annabelle received a short message from Mr. Elliot by evening post. It read, "Lot 9 suspended." He did not take it well. She folded the note, placed it in the fire, and watched it burn down to nothing. Marcus had never enjoyed looking at ledgers. That had always been the work of hired men, accountants who sat in small rooms and told him how much he could spend. He trusted them the way he trusted the men who shoed his horses. So when he summoned Mr. Crawley, his estate accountant, to the library at Ashwood Manor on the evening after the failed auction, it was the first time in over a year that Marcus had sat down with his own financial records spread in front of him. The library was warm, lit by oil lamps and a fire burning low in the hearth. Marcus sat behind the mahogany desk, still in his riding coat. Mr. Crawley, a careful, round-shouldered man with spectacles on the tip of his nose, sat across from him with 3 account books open and a growing expression of concern. "Start from the beginning," Marcus said. "I want to know exactly who holds the mortgage on the Whitmore Bay parcel and how they acquired it." Mr. Crawley adjusted his spectacles and turned to the first ledger. "The Whitmore Bay mortgage was originally issued by Harding & Sons, the banking house in Chelsworth. You took the loan 18 months ago at 4% interest, secured against the Ashwood Eastern farmlands." "I know all of that. Who bought the mortgage?" "The transfer notice names the House of Montfort as the purchasing party, acting through a London solicitor called Barrow & Associates. The purchase was made 3 days ago." Marcus leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers together. "The same name from the auction. This Montfort family. Who are they? What do they want with a farmland mortgage in the south?" Mr. Crawley hesitated. He turned several pages in the second ledger, running his finger down columns of figures, and the concern on his face deepened into something closer to alarm. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "I need to show you something." He turned the ledger around so Marcus could see the page, a summary of every outstanding debt, mortgage, and line of credit attached to the Ashwood estate. 14 entries in total, accumulated over 3 years. Marcus had borrowed against farmland, timber rights, rental income from tenant villages, and the projected value of a harbour development that had never been built. I have been cross-referencing these obligations with the banking records over the past several hours, Mr. Crawley said. Each of these debts was originally held by a different lender: Harding & Sons, the Chelsworth Trust, Blackmore's Private Bank, and several smaller firms. And? Mr. Crawley removed his spectacles and set them on the desk. It was the gesture of a man who wanted to look his employer in the eye without anything between them. Every single one of these debts has been transferred. All 14. Over the past 10 months, each lender has sold your loan to the same buyer.
The House of Montfort now holds every mortgage, every note, and every open line of credit attached to this estate.
The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, a night bird called from somewhere in the garden. Marcus did not move for a long time. "That is impossible," he said finally. "A single buyer cannot purchase another man's debts without his knowledge. There are disclosure requirements. The lenders are obligated to notify me." "They are obligated to notify you of a transfer, yes," Mr. Crawley said carefully. "And, technically, they did. Each transfer generated a notice letter, which was sent to this estate. I found all 14 of them filed in the correspondence cabinet in the East Wing. They were addressed to you and marked as routine administrative updates." Marcus stared at him. "I never read those letters." "No, Your Grace, you did not." The silence that followed filled the room like cold water rising around furniture. Marcus stood and walked to the window. The grounds of Ashwood Manor stretched out beneath the moonlight. The formal gardens, the stone fountain, the long drive lined with elm trees. Everything he could see from this window, everything he had built his name upon, now rested in the hands of a family he had never met. "How much?" he asked without turning around. "The total. All 14 debts combined." Mr. Crawley consulted the ledger one final time. £17,400, including accrued interest. Marcus placed both hands on the windowsill. £17,000. Lady Genevieve's dowry was 12,000. Even if the marriage went ahead tomorrow and every penny of her dowry was applied to the debt, he would still owe £5,000 to the House of Montfort, with no means to repay it.
And that assumed the Montfort family would let him repay on his terms.
As the sole creditor, they could call in every debt at once. If they did, Marcus would be forced to sell. Farmlands first, then timber rights, then the tenant villages, and eventually the manor itself. He turned from the window. "Can we negotiate? Offer them a repayment schedule?" Mr. Crawley shook his head slowly. "I have already written to Barrow and Associates requesting a meeting. They responded this afternoon with a single sentence." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded note. Marcus took it and read the words printed in clean, formal script. "The House of Montfort does not negotiate with debtors. All claims will be addressed through the High Court of Chancery at the appropriate time." Marcus read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it on the desk as though it might crumble if he held it any longer. "Find out who they are," he said quietly. "The Montfort family. Their estate, their connections, their agents. I want to know everything about them by the end of the week." Mr. Crawley gathered his ledgers and stood. "I will make inquiries, Your Grace." When the accountant left, Marcus remained standing at the window. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room had grown cold, but he did not call for a servant to stoke it. He thought about Annabelle. He did not know why. It was a passing thing. Her face, as she had sat across from him in this very room, signing the divorce papers with that unsettling calm. The way she had looked at him before she left. The strange comment about debts arriving at inconvenient moments. He shook his head and poured himself a measure of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard. It was a coincidence. It had to be. The provincial assembly rooms in Chelsworth had hosted every important social gathering in the county for 60 years. Grand chandeliers hung from a painted ceiling, tall mirrors lined the ballroom walls, and the air smelled of beeswax candles, French perfume, and old money. Marcus and Genevieve arrived at 8:30. He wore a black evening coat with a high white cravat and a gold pin at the collar. She wore a cream satin gown with pearl embroidery across the bodice and a diamond pendant that caught the light every time she moved. They entered through the main doors arm in arm, and Marcus made certain the room saw them before they saw the room. This was the evening he had been planning since the divorce papers were signed. A formal, public introduction of Lady Genevieve as his future Duchess. A line drawn under the old marriage and a bold stroke across the beginning of the new one. The first hour went according to plan. They took their place near the head of the ballroom, accepted glasses of champagne from a liveried footman, and greeted the guests who approached. Several families offered polite congratulations. A baronet's wife complimented Genevieve's gown. A retired colonel shook Marcus's hand and wished him well. Then the current began to shift. It started with small things, a conversation that ended too quickly, a couple who changed direction when they saw Marcus approaching, a group of older gentlemen near the fireplace who lowered their voices as he passed. Marcus noticed it the way a man notices a draft in a warm room. Something cold had entered, and he could not find the source. By the second hour, the pattern was unmistakable. Baron Henley, who had dined at Ashwood Manor twice in the past year, walked past Marcus without a word. The Countess of Brigham, who had always been eager for Genevieve's company, declined an invitation to sit together with a thin excuse about a headache. Sir Rowland Price, the most influential landowner in the county, looked directly at Marcus across the ballroom, held his gaze for a single deliberate moment, and turned his back. Marcus stood very still, his champagne glass untouched in his hand, watching the room rearrange itself around him.
Genevieve noticed it too. Her smile had grown tighter with each passing quarter hour, and her fan moved in short, irritated strokes.
"They are being strange tonight," she murmured.
"It is nothing," Marcus said. "Country manners." It was not nothing. What Marcus did not know, and what the room's most connected families had learned through private letters delivered that morning, was that the Lord Chancellor's office in London had quietly initiated a judicial review of the Ashwood estate finances. The letters had come from associates, cousins, solicitors, and old school friends in the capital. The details were sparse, but the message was consistent. The Duke of Ashwood was under investigation, and anyone seen too close to him might find their own name drawn into the inquiry. Society could forgive many things. It could overlook affairs, tolerate bad manners, and ignore moderate debts. It could not overlook the possibility of being associated with a man whose finances were about to be examined by the High Court. And so the room pulled away from Marcus like the tide retreating from a pier. It was near the end of the second hour when Genevieve spotted Annabelle. She was sitting on a cushioned bench near the far balcony, dressed in a simple dark blue gown with no jewelry except a thin gold chain at her throat. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest lace cap, and she held a small glass of cordial in both hands. She looked like exactly what Marcus had always called her, a quiet woman of no consequence. Genevieve's eyes narrowed. She crossed the ballroom floor, weaving between dancing couples, until she stood directly in front of Annabelle's bench. "I had not expected to see you here," Genevieve said, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest guests to hear. "I assumed you would have left the county by now. Surely there is very little to keep a woman of your circumstances at an event like this." Annabelle looked up. She took a slow sip of her cordial and set it down on the bench beside her. "I was invited, Lady Genevieve, the same as everyone else." "Invited out of pity, I imagine." Genevieve opened her fan and tilted her chin upward. "The hosts must have felt sorry for you. A divorced woman with no family and no fortune, sitting alone at a ball. It is almost charitable."
Several heads turned. Conversations paused. The nearest cluster of guests watched with the practiced attention of people who had been raised to observe without appearing to do so. Annabelle said nothing for a moment. She let the silence do its work. Let Genevieve stand there, fan in hand, waiting for a reaction she would not receive. Then she smiled. A small, measured smile that did not reach her eyes. "I do hope you enjoy the evening, Lady Genevieve. Nights like these have a way of being remembered for a very long time." Genevieve opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Baron Henley's wife appeared at Annabelle's side. She sat down on the bench, took Annabelle's hand, and began speaking to her in warm, familiar tones, as though Genevieve were not there at all. Within minutes, 2 more women joined them. The wife of Sir Roland Price brought Annabelle a fresh glass of cordial. The Countess of Brigham asked after her health with genuine concern. One by one, the very women who had avoided Marcus and Genevieve all evening gathered around the bench near the balcony like birds settling on a branch. Genevieve stood alone in the middle of the ballroom floor, her fan motionless, watching the circle form around the woman she had come to humiliate. She returned to Marcus's side without a word. He looked at her face and understood, for the first time with real clarity, that something was happening far beyond a failed land auction and a transferred mortgage. Someone was dismantling his world, piece by piece, and he still could not see who was holding the blade.
Across the ballroom, Annabelle accepted the Countess's arm and walked with her toward the supper room. She did not look back at Marcus once. She did not need to. Marcus left Ashwood Manor before dawn. He travelled by private coach, drawn by 4 horses, and accompanied by Mr. Aldrich and a junior clerk who carried 2 leather cases stuffed with documents. Genevieve had wanted to come, but Marcus had told her to stay behind. London was for legal matters, he said. He would return within 2 days with the divorce finalized, his name cleared, and the mysterious Montfort business put to rest. He believed every word of it. The journey took a day and a half, with overnight lodgings at a coaching inn outside Reading. Marcus spent most of the ride reviewing the papers Mr. Aldrich had prepared. A petition requesting formal dissolution of his marriage, a sworn statement regarding Annabelle's lack of dowry, and a motion to dismiss any financial claims against the estate as baseless interference. Mr. Aldrich sat across from him, quieter than usual since the encounter in Blackwood Village, where Annabelle had torn apart his indemnity rider. He had not mentioned that meeting to Marcus, not the 3 legal errors, not the word she had used. Fraud. It still echoed every time he picked up a pen. He had, however, hired a London barrister named Mr. Pembroke, recommended by 3 peers, with a reputation for winning difficult cases through sheer force of argument. They arrived in London on the morning of day 11. The city was alive, carriages rattling over cobblestones, street vendors calling from every corner, coal smoke drifting through narrow lanes. Marcus had always felt at home here. The capital was built for men like him. The Royal High Court of Chancery occupied a stone-fronted building near Lincoln's Inn Fields, with iron gates and a courtyard where barristers in black gowns walked between hearings. Marcus stepped from his coach and straightened his coat. Charcoal grey morning suit, polished boots, silk cravat pinned with a sapphire. He looked like a duke. He intended to be treated like one. Mr. Pembroke met them in the entrance hall. He was a tall, sharp-featured man in his 50s, with a deep voice and the calm manner of someone who had stood before judges so many times that courtrooms felt like drawing rooms. He shook Marcus's hand and led the party into a private consultation chamber off the main corridor. "I have reviewed your papers," Pembroke said, setting his own documents on the table. "The petition for divorce is straightforward. Incompatibility of station is an accepted ground in ecclesiastical proceedings, and the absence of a dowry strengthens your position. I will argue that the marriage was entered into under incomplete disclosure,
and that the dissolution serves the interests of both parties. Marcus nodded. And the Montfort matter? Pembroke paused. He opened a folder and removed a single sheet of paper, a summary he had compiled from the court's preliminary docket. That is where things become more complicated, he said. The name House of Montfort has appeared on 3 separate filings with the Chancery over the past week. The first is the mortgage transfer that blocked your land auction. The second is a formal complaint regarding financial irregularities at the Ashwood estate. The third is a request for judicial review of all debts held against your properties. Marcus felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Filed by whom? The filings are made through Barrow and Associates, acting as agents for the House of Montfort. No individual name is attached. The court has accepted all 3 filings and assigned them to the Lord Chancellor for review. Can we challenge them? Pembroke considered this. We can challenge the standing of the complainant, argue that the House of Montfort has no direct interest in your estate and therefore no legal basis to file. It is a procedural argument and it may buy time.
But I must be candid with you, Your Grace. If the court has already accepted the filings and assigned them to the Chancellor personally, there is a reason for that. The Chancellor does not take cases lightly. Marcus looked at Mr. Aldridge, who was studying the surface of the table, as though the wood grain contained answers he desperately needed. We proceed as planned, Marcus said. Present the divorce petition first. Establish the record. Once the marriage is dissolved and Annabelle has no legal standing as my wife, the Montfort filings lose their relevance. Pembroke gathered his papers and stood. The hearing is scheduled for midday. The Chancellor will preside. I will present the petition, and we should have a preliminary ruling by the afternoon. They walked through the corridors of the Chancery, past oil portraits of former Lord Chancellors, past clerks carrying briefs tied with red ribbon, past the murmur of legal conversations echoing off stone walls. Marcus walked with his shoulders squared, the way he walked into every room he had ever entered. The courtroom was large, panelled in dark oak, with rows of benches for spectators and a raised platform where the Chancellor's seat stood empty beneath a carved coat of arms. Tall windows let in pale morning light that fell across the wooden floor in long, quiet columns. Marcus took his seat at the petitioner's bench. Mr. Aldrich sat beside him. Mr. Pembroke stood at the bar table, adjusting his gown and arranging his papers with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The courtroom was fuller than Marcus had expected. Several barristers occupied the side benches, and a gallery of observers filled the upper seats. Word, it seemed, had travelled. He glanced at the respondent's bench across the aisle. It was empty. Annabelle had not arrived. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile. Perhaps she had decided not to contest the petition. Perhaps she had accepted her fate and stayed in Blackwood Village, where women of her kind belonged. The thought settled comfortably over him like a warm coat. He turned to Pembroke. It appears we are unopposed. Pembroke looked at the empty bench, then at the gallery, then at the side door near the Chancellor's platform. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The careful alertness of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to know that an empty bench did not always mean an absent opponent. Sometimes it meant the opponent had no need to sit where you expected them to. Let us wait for the Chancellor, Pembroke said quietly. The clock on the wall above the gallery read 5 minutes to noon. The clock struck 12, and the courtroom doors opened. A clerk in formal robes stepped through first, carrying a ceremonial staff topped with a brass crown. He struck it twice against the stone floor, and the sound rang through the panelled room like a bell. All rise for the Right Honourable Sir Edward Halling, Lord High Chancellor of England. The gallery stood. Marcus stood. Mr. Pembroke straightened his gown and clasped his hands behind his back.
Even the barristers on the side benches, who had seen 100 chancellors take the bench, rose with particular attention. There was something different about the atmosphere in the courtroom, a formality that exceeded what a simple divorce petition would normally command. The Lord Chancellor entered from the side door. He was a broad man in his 60s, dressed in the full black and gold robes of his office, with a heavy chain of state across his shoulders. His face was set in the serious, measured expression of someone who had already read every document related to the case and had formed opinions he was not yet ready to share. Behind him came something Marcus had not expected. 4 members of the Sovereign's Guard walked in formation through the side door, 2 on each flank. They wore scarlet coats with gold braiding and ceremonial swords at their sides.
Their boots struck the floor in perfect unison, and the sound silenced every whisper in the gallery. Marcus stared. Pembroke stared. Mr. Aldridge gripped the edge of the bench with both hands. The Sovereign's Guard did not attend divorce hearings. They did not attend any chancery hearing unless the case involved a matter of crown interest or a member of the highest aristocratic order. The Chancellor took his seat on the raised platform and arranged his papers. The guard positioned themselves at the 4 corners of the courtroom. The clerk struck his staff once more. The court will hear the matter of the Duke of Ashwood versus the Duchess of Ashwood, consolidated with the matter of the House of Montfort versus the estate of the Duke of Ashwood. Consolidated. Marcus's divorce petition had been merged with the Montfort financial complaint. Everything, the marriage, the debts, the fraud allegations, would be heard together, in front of the Chancellor and a gallery watching him with undisguised fascination. He turned to Pembroke. "They cannot consolidate without my consent." Pembroke's jaw was tight. "They can if the Chancellor determines the matters are materially connected." And he has. Before Marcus could respond, the clerk spoke again. "The court calls the respondent." The main doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Annabelle walked in. She did not look like the woman Marcus had married. She did not look like the quiet, plainly dressed wife who had sat across from him in his study and signed divorce papers without raising her voice. She did not look like the woman Genevieve had mocked at the assembly rooms, sitting alone near the balcony with a glass of cordial. She looked like exactly what she was. She wore a formal mantle of deep crimson velvet, lined with white ermine and clasped at the throat with a gold brooch bearing the Montfort falcon. The mantle fell from her shoulders to the floor, trailing behind her as she walked. Beneath it, she wore a gown of midnight blue silk, fitted and precise, with silver embroidery along the sleeves. Her dark hair was swept up and held in place by a thin circlet of gold, a coronet reserved for members of the archducal rank. On her right hand, catching the courtroom light with every step, was the gold signet ring engraved with the crest of the House of Montfort. She was flanked by 2 attendants in the Montfort livery, dark blue coats with the falcon crest stitched in silver thread on the breast. They walked 1 step behind her, carrying leather folios of documents. The gallery erupted. Murmurs became open conversation, and the Chancellor rapped his gavel twice before the room settled. Every barrister had turned to watch. Several older men in the gallery had risen, men who recognized the Montfort mantle, who knew what that crest meant, who understood that the woman walking down the aisle held a rank most people in this room would never come close to. Marcus did not move. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His face had gone completely white. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes followed Annabelle, or the woman he had known as Annabelle, as she walked past his bench without a single glance in his direction. She took her place at the respondent's bench. Her attendants set the leather folios on the table and stepped back. She folded her hands, looked up at the Chancellor, and inclined her head in a gesture of formal respect between equals. The Chancellor returned the gesture. Mr. Aldrich made a small sound, something between a gasp and a groan,
and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. The signature. The practiced handwriting on the divorce papers. He had known something was wrong. He had felt it in his trembling hands that morning in the study. And now he understood. Pembroke leaned toward Marcus and spoke in a voice barely above a breath. "Your Grace, who is that woman?" Marcus could not answer. He could not think of a single word.
3 years of marriage, and he had never once questioned where Annabelle came from, what she knew, or why a woman of supposedly no background could dismantle a legal document in minutes and cite property statutes from memory. He had never asked, because he had never considered her worth asking about. The Chancellor opened the first folio on his desk and looked down at both benches. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice filling the courtroom with the weight of carved stone, "the court acknowledges the presence of Her Grace, Archduchess Clara of the House of Montfort, respondent in the matter of dissolution and primary complainant in the matter of estate fraud." Archduchess. The word moved through the gallery like a wave through still water. Marcus heard it, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be the smallest person in a room. Annabelle, Clara, sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her expression calm, her crimson mantle pooling at her feet like a verdict already written. She did not look at Marcus. She did not need to. The Chancellor opened the first leather folio and began to read. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the walls and makes the ticking of the clock above the gallery sound like a hammer. Marcus sat rigid at the petitioner's bench, his eyes fixed on the Chancellor's face. "The court has received and examined a comprehensive body of evidence submitted by the House of Montfort over the preceding 10 days, the Chancellor said. This evidence pertains to the financial management of the Ashwood estate under the stewardship of His Grace, the Duke of Ashwood, covering a period of approximately 3 years. He turned a page. The evidence includes copies of 14 separate loan agreements, mortgage deeds, and lines of credit taken against Ashwood estate properties. Cross-referenced with the original land valuations held on file at the county registry, these documents reveal a consistent pattern of overvaluation. In 11 of the 14 cases, the stated value of the collateral property was inflated by between 30 and 60% above its true market worth. A murmur passed through the gallery. The Chancellor paused long enough for it to fade. These inflated valuations were provided by a single land surveyor, Mr. Albert Finch, who has since been located by agents of the court and has provided a sworn deposition confirming that he was instructed by the Duke of Ashwood to produce favourable assessments in exchange for a quarterly retainer paid from the estate's private accounts. Marcus swallowed hard, his fingers pressing deeper into the table. Pembroke sat beside him with his pen motionless above his notepad. There was nothing to argue. The evidence was being read into the record by the Lord Chancellor himself, which meant it had already been verified and accepted. The Chancellor continued. The funds obtained through these fraudulent mortgages were not applied to the estate's maintenance. Banking records show that the majority, in excess of £11,000, was directed to personal expenditures. These include the lease of a private townhouse in Mayfair, a wardrobe account with 3 London tailors, the purchase of a racing stable in Epsom, and regular payments to accounts held in the name of Lady Genevieve Harcourt. The gallery did not murmur this time. It held its breath. The court further notes that estate trust funds designated for tenant upkeep, agricultural repair, and staff wages were diverted to cover loan interest. Tenant families on the Ashwood lands have endured deteriorating conditions for 2 years, while the Duke maintained an appearance of prosperity funded entirely by debt. The Chancellor closed the folio and set it aside. He folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at Marcus.
Your Grace, do you wish to respond to these findings? Every head in the courtroom turned toward the petitioner's bench.
Marcus opened his mouth. For a terrible, stretched moment, nothing came. Pembroke placed a hand on his arm, a quiet signal to remain silent, but Marcus shook it off. "These are the accusations of a stranger," he said. His voice came out thinner than he intended. "The House of Montfort has no standing in my affairs. I have never met them, never dealt with them. They have inserted themselves into my private matters, and I demand to know who authorized this investigation." The Chancellor's expression did not change. He turned to the respondent's bench. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Clara, "would you care to clarify your standing in this matter?" Clara rose from her seat. The crimson mantle shifted across her shoulders as she stood, and the courtroom light caught the gold signet ring on her right hand. "My Lord Chancellor," she said, and her voice carried the clarity of someone who had been trained to address rooms far larger than this one. 3 years ago, the House of Montfort received reports of financial irregularities among several estates in the southern counties. As the senior representative of my family, I undertook a private audit under an assumed name. I entered the household of the Duke of Ashwood as his wife, with the full knowledge and authorization of the Lord Chancellor's office." She paused. The courtroom was so still that the creak of a bench in the gallery sounded like a gunshot. "During those 3 years, I had unrestricted access to the Duke's financial records, his correspondence, and his private accounts. Every document submitted to this court was copied by my own hand from originals at Ashwood Manor. The Duke was not aware of my identity because the audit required that he should not be." She turned and looked at Marcus for the first time since she had entered the courtroom. Her gaze was steady and calm and carried no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph. It was the look of someone completing a task they had set out to do, nothing more. Marcus stared back at her. His face had passed through white and settled into something gray and hollow, like a man watching his own house burn from across a field. The Chancellor spoke again. "In light of the evidence presented, this court rules as follows. The petition for divorce filed by the Duke of Ashwood is granted, on the amended terms proposed by the respondent. The marriage between the Duke of Ashwood and Archduchess Clara of the House of Montfort is hereby dissolved." He reached for the second folio. "Furthermore, all financial obligations held by the House of Montfort against the Ashwood estate, totaling £17,400, are called due immediately. The estate of Ashwood Manor, including all attached farmlands, timber rights, and tenant properties, is placed into receivership under the supervision of this court until such time as the debts are satisfied in full." The gavel fell once. The sound echoed through the oak-paneled room and settled into the bones of every person sitting in it. Marcus did not move. Pembroke began quietly packing his papers into his case. Mr. Aldrich sat with his head bowed and his spectacles in his hand. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to present, and nothing left to save. Clara gathered her folios, inclined her head to the Chancellor, and walked back down the center aisle with her attendants behind her. The crimson mantle trailed across the floor, and the gallery watched in complete silence. She did not pause at Marcus's bench. She did not offer a final word. The doors closed behind her, and Marcus sat alone in a courtroom that had just taken everything he had. The weather broke on the morning Marcus lost Ashwood Manor. A hard rain had fallen through the night, turning the gravel drive to mud. By dawn, the clouds pulled apart just enough to let a pale light fall across the estate grounds, catching the wet stone of the house and the iron scrollwork of the gates.
3 days had passed since the courtroom.
He had returned from London in silence, with Mr. Aldrich beside him and a stack of legal papers on the seat that neither could bring themselves to open. Genevieve had been waiting at Ashwood. She had heard nothing, and the sight of Marcus walking through the front door with the color drained from his face told her everything before he spoke. He told her that evening, in the study where he had once handed Annabelle her divorce papers. The estate was in receivership. The debts had been called. Every property, every acre attached to the Ashwood name now belonged to the court until £17,000 was repaid. Genevieve listened to all of it from the chair by the fireplace. When he finished, she asked one question. "What about my dowry?" Marcus stared at her. "Your dowry was never transferred. The marriage contract with your father has not been signed." "Then it will not be signed," Genevieve said. She stood and walked out of the study. By the following morning, her trunks were loaded onto her father's carriage, and she was gone from Ashwood without leaving so much as a note. Marcus watched her carriage disappear from the upstairs window. On the morning of day 14, 2 officers of the Chancery Court arrived at the estate gates with a formal writ of possession. They were accompanied by a clerk from the county registry and a locksmith. The writ stated that the Duke of Ashwood was required to vacate the property by noon, retaining only his personal clothing and any items not listed among the estate's assets. Marcus stood in the entrance hall and watched the officers walk through his house, room by room, cataloging paintings, furniture, silverware, and china. They walked through the stables and counted the horses. They opened the study where Marcus had conducted every piece of business he had ever cared about, and they wrote its contents into a numbered list. Mr. Cavendish stood at the foot of the servants' staircase, his hands clasped behind his back. The household staff had been informed the previous evening. Some of the younger maids had wept. The cook had left a basket of food outside Marcus's bedroom door, though whether out of pity or habit, nobody could say. Marcus descended the front steps for the last time at 11:30. He carried a single leather bag over his shoulder. He wore his traveling coat and a pair of boots that needed resoling. The gold watch chain that had once glinted at his waist was gone. It had been listed among the estate assets. He walked through the gates of Ashwood Manor and turned left onto the high road. He did not look back at the house. He could not afford to, and that word, afford, had taken on a meaning it had never carried before. He had no title of practical use. The receivership had stripped his estate, dissolved his credit, and published the Chancery findings in the London legal registers. No bank would lend to him. No family of standing would receive him. The name Duke of Ashwood, which had once opened every door in 3 counties, now closed them. He walked alone down the high road toward the village, and the few people he passed, a farmer mending a stone wall, a woman carrying a pail from the dairy, watched him go with the quiet, careful attention of people who had known for some time that this day was coming. An hour after Marcus left, a second procession arrived at the Ashwood gates. A carriage came first, tall, polished black, drawn by 4 matched gray horses with silver-trimmed bridles. The Montfort falcon was painted in gold on the door panels. Behind it followed a second carriage carrying attendants and luggage, and behind that, a mounted escort of 4 riders in dark blue livery. The gates were opened by the Chancery officers, who stepped aside and removed their hats.
Archduchess Clara of the House of Montfort stepped from the carriage onto the gravel drive of the estate she had once walked through as a dismissed wife, in a plain muslin dress. She wore a travelling gown of deep grey wool, cut simply, with a dark blue cloak fastened at the collar by the Montfort falcon brooch. Her hair was pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and the gold signet ring sat on her right hand, where it would remain from this day forward. She looked at the house, the ivy-covered walls, the tall chimneys, the front steps she had descended 2 weeks earlier with a canvas bag on her shoulder, and her expression carried something that was difficult to read. It might have been satisfaction. It might have been sorrow.
It might have been the weight of knowing that 3 years of her life had been spent inside those walls, living as someone she was not, in order to bring down a man who had never once thought to look closely at the woman sitting across from him at the breakfast table. Mr. Cavendish appeared at the front door. "Your Grace," he said, and this time the words carried their full and rightful meaning. Clara inclined her head. "Mr. Cavendish, I trust the household is in order?" "It is, Your Grace. It always has been." She walked up the front steps, through the door, and into the entrance hall of Ashwood Manor. She paused for a moment beneath the painted portraits of every duke who had held the estate before Marcus, the same portraits that had watched her leave 14 days ago. She removed her gloves, set them on the hall table, and turned to her attendant. "Send word to London. The audit of the southern estates is complete. I am returning home." The attendant bowed and withdrew. Clara stood alone in the entrance hall, sunlight falling through the tall windows onto the stone floor at her feet. The house was quiet. The rain had stopped. And somewhere on the high road, a man who had once believed himself untouchable was learning, step by muddy step, what it meant to have nothing at all.